Chapters 3 and 4 of Anybody But Anne by Carolyn Wells. This recording is in the public domain. 3. All About a Fan. "You are sure I understand what, Miss Fordyce?" he asked. "I assure you my understanding is not limitless."
"Oh, understand clairvoyance and all that sort of thing. You must, you know, with all your wonderful detective ability. Please tell us all about yourself, won't you? I never saw a real detective before, and they're awfully different from what I imagined. I thought they were more
"Unwashed," put in Archer bluntly. "I am not myself acquainted with many of them, but those I have met are not in Mr. Stone's class socially by any means." "They're not in his class professionally either," I declared, anxious to have Fleming Stone aware of my appreciation of his genius. "Mr. Stone is in a class by himself. His work is art, that's what it is." "Thank you," said Fleming Stone, but in the smile he gave me there was a slight tinge of that boredness that masters always feel at compliments from tyros. "My art, as you call it, is my life," he went on simply. "I do not study it. I simply practice it as it comes along. And after all, any success I may have had is merely the rational outcome of logical observation."
"Oh, don't depreciate yourself, Mr. Stone," said Mrs. Stelton, shaking a silly finger at him. "You know you are the greatest detective ever. Mr. Sturgis told me so. And now you simply must, tell us just how you do it, and give us an example. Here, take my fan, and deduce my whole mental caliber from it."
Although Fleming Stone looked at the speaker pleasantly, I was convinced that he felt as I did, that it would be perfectly easy to deduce the lady's mental caliber without the assistance of her lace fan.
"Yes, do. What fun!"
exclaimed Morland Van Wyck, who was standing at the elbow of the fair widow who had enslaved him. Before Fleming Stone could reply, Anne spoke.
"That wouldn't be a fair test," she said, flashing a smile at Stone. And then her eyes curiously deepened with earnestness as she went on. "But I do wish, Mr. Stone, that you would do something like that for us. I have heard that you can tell all about anyone just from seeing some article that they have used."
"That is not a difficult thing to do, Mrs. Van Wyck," said Stone. "You yourself could probably gather a great deal of information from any personal belonging of a stranger."
"Oh, yes," returned Anne gaily. "If I saw a thimble, I might deduce a sewing woman, or a pipe a man who smoked. But I don't mean that. I mean the sort of thing you do. Please give us an example."
I fairly cringed at the thought of Fleming Stone being stood up to do parlor tricks like a society circus, and so incensed was I that the line, "butchered to make a Roman holiday," vaguely passed through my mind. But as I saw Anne's vivid, glowing face and her entreating eyes, I felt sure that no man on earth could deny her anything. Stone appeared to take it casually. "Certainly, Mrs. Van Wyck," he said, "if it will please you. I have never done such a thing, except in the interests of my work, but if you will give me a personal belonging of some one unknown to me, I will repeat to you whatever it may tell me concerning its owner." Though Beth Fordyce had said nothing during this latter conversation, I think she had never once moved her eyes from Stone's face. Her large and light blue eyes looked at him with an absorbed gaze, and she spoke tranquilly but with a positive air.
"I will provide the article," she said. "I have with me just the very thing. Excuse me, I will get it."
She glided away, for no other verb of motion expresses her peculiar walk, and disappeared through the door that led into the main part of the house.
"How lovely!" cried Mrs. Stelton, clasping her hands in delight. "And then, Mr. Stone, will you tell us how you catch robbers by their footprints?"
"Alas, madam," said Stone, "robbers are rarely considerate enough to leave their footprints for my benefit. I know they have the reputation of doing so, but they are sadly remiss in the matter, and show a surprising negligence of their duty to me." "A sort of criminal negligence," murmured Archer, and Stone grinned appreciatively. Miss Fordyce returned, and as she crossed the room, her pale green gown trailing, she came toward Stone with a rapt expression.
"I can help you," she said, "because I can evolve a mental picture of my friend, and project it to your mind by will power.
"Pray don't trouble to do that, Miss Fordyce," said Stone, unable to keep a quizzical smile entirely suppressed. "You force me to confess that I have no knowledge of the occult, and depend entirely upon my own very practical common sense and logic. What have you brought me?"
"A fan," answered Miss Fordyce, handing him one. "When I came up in the train this afternoon, a friend was with me during part of the journey. She lent me this fan, and I carelessly forgot to return it. As I know my friend very well, and you do not know her at all, it is a fair test." "Fine!" said Anne Van Wyck, her intense eyes darkening with interest. "Beth, that is just the thing. Now, Mr. Stone, tell us of the fan's owner."
In her interest Anne had moved nearer to Stone, and was breathlessly awaiting his words. The magnetic fascination of the woman is indescribable. I am positive that nothing on earth would have induced Fleming Stone to such an exhibition of his special powers of deduction, except Anne's compelling desire that he should. I saw, too, though it was almost imperceptible, the effort Stone was obliged to make to detach his attention from her and concentrate it on the fan he was holding. "To approach this matter in my usual way," he said quietly, "I shall have to ask permission to examine this fan under a magnifying glass. Have you one at hand?"
"Here is one,"
said Morland, bringing a fine one from his father's desk, at which action I fancied I saw a shade of annoyance pass over David Van Wyck's face. For a few moments Fleming Stone examined the fan through the glass. In idle curiosity I looked at the faces of those grouped about. Mr. Van Wyck was clearly annoyed at the whole performance, though Morland, under the influence of Mrs. Stelton, waited in delighted anticipation. Condren Archer looked supercilious, and even murmured to me that he doubted the detective's powers in such a test. Miss Fordyce wore the exalted air usual to people who affect the mystic. But Anne, the centre of the group, was surely enough to inspire Stone's latent powers to the utmost. She waited with a suppressed eagerness that seemed to show implicit faith in the result, and she even touched the fan as she too scanned it for any enlightening details. Fleming Stone returned the glass to Morland and the fan to Miss Fordyce. But it was Anne whom he addressed. "The fan," he said in a quiet narrative way, "belongs to a lady with dark hair and eyes, and rosy cheeks, and a very perfect set of small white teeth. She is healthy and rather robust, of a vigorous but not an athletic type. She is strong of muscle, but of rather a nervous temperament. She is thrifty and economical by nature, but proud and fastidious. Usually of decorous habits, but likes occasionally a gayer experience. She is refined in her personal tastes and artistic in dressing, though fond of bright colors. She is kind and generous hearted, unmarried, and past her first youth. She lives in or near the West 80s in New York City, and her telephone number has recently been changed to 9863 Schuyler. She is fond of embroidering with colored silks. She possesses a gown decorated with black spangled trimming, and she wears a very heavy ring on the little finger of her right hand." Stone finished as quietly as he had begun, but his listeners were more excited.
"I don't believe a word of it,"
Mrs. Stelton was saying, and of course Morland agreed with her. But Beth Fordyce was speaking almost as if in a trance.
"It is every word true,"
she said with a far-away look in her eyes.
"If you had known Lila, you could not have described her more perfectly. Don't try to make me believe you are not occult. You are positively clairvoyant." "Nonsense, Beth," said Anne impatiently. "Don't talk such rubbish." "No," said I, "occultism isn't in it with this kind of work. Mr. Stone, that is the real thing. Are you going to tell your processes of reasoning?" "Of course he is," cried Anne. "That will be the delightful part of it. David, did you ever hear anything like it?"
Though Anne turned her lovely flushed face toward her husband, she received no answering smile. "It doesn't interest me," he said coldly, and it is a tribute to Anne's tact and cleverness that she quickly recovered this awkward speech by turning to Stone, saying with utmost charm of manner,
"Tell me all about it at once. I can't wait another minute."
"My dear Mrs. Van Wyck," said Stone, seeming to address her only, "I am very glad to explain, if it interests you. You see, it's very simple, for this fan has been used a good deal, and naturally bears the impress of the lady who has used it. To begin with, it is a souvenir fan that was given to the lady when she dined in the restaurant of one of the larger hotels in New York. It is of the inexpensive paper sort that is used for that purpose. But the name of the restaurant has been carefully scratched out, showing that the lady desired to keep and use it, but did not care to have her friends know where she obtained it. This shows that the lady is not amply provided with fans, and shows, too, that she does not often frequent the gay restaurants. The fan is bright scarlet and gold, and, since she liked it well enough to keep it, I assume that it suited her brunette coloring, and also that she is fond of bright hues. She is nervous, because the fan shows that she has often picked at it, both its edge and its tassel, and has even frequently bitten it with her small sharp teeth. You see, these lacquered sticks show clearly all marks and scratches, and this bar of metal that holds the tassel is much bent, showing a vigorous and healthy type. The fact that the fan has been used a great deal shows a robust and rosy-cheeked young woman, though not athletic, for athletic girls never use a fan. She is refined and fastidious in her tastes, for I notice a faint perfume of orris and violet. She is generous, for she gave away a fan that she found useful; and I think neither a very young girl nor a married lady would so long preserve a fan of this sort." "But how did you know where she lives?" demanded Miss Fordyce. "That argues a lack of observation on your part," said Stone, smiling. "On this light corner of the fan is written, though faintly, 'New, No. 9863, Schuyler.' The people living in the vicinity of West 83rd Street have recently had a change in their telephone numbers, and when she noted a new number on her fan, I assumed it to be her own." "It is," said Miss Fordyce. "But how did you know about her spangled dress and that curious ring she wears?" "The ring left a decided impression on the outer sticks of the fan near the end, in such a position that it could only come from the abrasion of a heavy ring worn on the little finger. Then, you see, this tassel, as is usual on this sort of a fan, is of a fine silk floss. It is much fluffed and tangled, and has a tendency to catch anything it may. In it I find a portion of a small black spangle, and 2 or 3 threads of fine embroidery floss, pink and green. Surely it is easy to infer that the lady uses embroidery silks frequently, and that the spangle is from one of her gowns." "Don't take it so casually," cried Anne, with an imperious nod at him. "You shall not so belittle your great powers. Supposing it is only logic and careful observation, no one else could do it. That fan could not have spoken to one of us, because our logic cannot understand its language. Mr. Stone, I thank you for doing that. I know you didn't want to." "It isn't my custom to deduce for social entertainments," said Stone, smiling at her. "But it is my custom to accede to the wishes of my hostess." "Thank you for that, then," and Anne smiled back at him. "Now, as a small return favor, may I show you over the house? Mrs. Davidson tells me you want to see it." "Yes, I'm interested. I understand it is very old, and was built by an eccentric." "Yes, it was, though we bought it from its second owner. Mr. Sturgis, will you go with us?" I was glad to accept the invitation, and as we started we were joined by Miss Fordyce and Archer, and also by Mrs. Stelton and Morland Van Wyck. So it was quite a party which followed Anne through the doorway in the corner. We found ourselves in a corridor that ran along the south side of the house. We passed a branch corridor bearing to the right, but Anne laughingly remarked that those were the apartments of herself and her husband, and we might not enter. We went on into a beautiful music room, through stately reception and drawing rooms, and into a delightful library. There were billiard and smoking rooms near by, and through the dining room and sunny breakfast room we passed out to the terrace and down into the gardens. I thought Stone seemed disappointed that though the house was old it gave no hint of secret passages or dark staircases; no dungeons or anything that savored of mystery or crime. I chanced to be walking by his side, and I rallied him on this. "It is so," he confessed. "From what I had heard of the house I had fancied it more complicated in structure. It is very 4 square." "Yes, it is," said I, as we looked at it from across the wide expanse of lawn and garden. "Curious construction, though," mused Stone, "and yet perfectly simple. One large rectangle with smaller rectangles attached at its two back corners." "Usually wings are built entirely across the ends," I observed. "Oh, of course it was done to get the advantage of light. Wings at the ends would have darkened many of the rooms; but attached so at the corners, there are windows all round each part of the house." This was true, and as I now recollected, every room was flooded with daylight. "I must join my hostess now," said Stone, "and make my adieux. I am leaving to night for Kansas City, where I'm about to investigate a most important case." I longed to ask him about it, but I didn't feel privileged to do so. I did, however, express my pleasure in knowing him, and hoped that we might meet again. He very courteously gave me his card, bearing an address that he said would always reach him, an attention that I prized highly, though it might never fulfill its purpose. We all returned to the study, and after the departure of the Davidsons and their distinguished friend, the talk naturally turned to Fleming Stone and his work. "It's uncanny, that's what it is," declared Mr. Van Wyck, "and it gives me the fidgets to have the man around." "I feel that way, too," said Connie Archer. "Why, I'm perfectly sure that he could see straight through my coat into my pocket and read a letter there that I wouldn't have anybody know about, not anybody." "Is it one I wrote you?" asked Anne, so roguishly that it was most apparent fooling, but her husband looked up and scowled. "Yes," returned Archer, with the most obvious intent of teasing his host, "that last delightful missive of yours." At this David Van Wyck frowned angrily, and Anne said, "Nonsense, Connie. Such jokes aren't funny. What is the letter about, really?" "It's a tailor's done," said Archer, taking his cue. "But I wouldn't have Stone know it for anything. I expect he pays his bills before they're due." "Of course he does," said Morland. "Deduces the exact amount they're going to be, and sends off a check without seeing 'em." "Well, don't ask him here again, Anne," said her husband. "I don't like him." "He won't come again very soon," I volunteered. "He's off to night for Kansas City." "Good thing, too," growled Mr. Van Wyck. "And now you people may seek some other pasture. I expect some callers to night, and I want to get this place into some semblance of a gentleman's study instead of a picnic ground." "Oh, David," said his wife, "are they coming to night?" "Yes, they are. My mind is made up, Anne, and I'd rather you wouldn't refer to the subject." "It's an outrage," said Morland, under his breath. He spoke to Anne, but his father heard it, and said, "None of that, boy. I suppose I have a right to do as I choose with my own. And if you know when you're well off, you'll accept the situation gracefully. It'll be better for you in the long run." Morland turned away, looking obstinate and sullen. I had no idea what it was all about, but when I looked at Anne her face was so tragic in its utter despair that I was startled. Surely I had been right in thinking her light-hearted manner was a cloak for some desperate heart-breaking trouble. But in obedience to Mr. Van Wyck's command, we all left the study. It was not quite time to dress for dinner, so we strolled out through the great doors on to the terrace; and even as we left, the footmen were already clearing away the tea things. 4. The Decision of David Van Wyck. From a certain terrace landing which Anne called her sunset view, we watched the last glowing clouds dull and darken in the west. A sort of depression had fallen on the party because, as was perfectly evident, of Anne's mood. She was distrait and preoccupied, though now and then her dark eyes flashed with what was unmistakably anger. "What's it all about, Anne dear?" said Archer, who let himself go a little when Mr. Van Wyck wasn't present. Instead of evading or parrying his question, Anne spoke out frankly. "It's just this," she said. "David is going to give away all his fortune. He's going to build and endow a magnificent library for Crescent Falls village, a library out of all proportion to a tiny little place like this." "All his fortune!" I exclaimed, astounded. "You can't mean that, Anne." "But I do mean just that. He calls it philanthropy. That's his fad this year. If we were really philanthropic it would be different, but he has become deeply absorbed in this ridiculous hobby for no reason at all except that he's always dashing into some new and crazy scheme.
And he's so determined. He'll give away all his money, and then afterward he'll be sorry, but he can't get it back. He has had fads and foibles before, but though sometimes they were trying, they never involved such an amount of money as this." "But, Anne," I went on, "you can't mean that he's going to give away all his money. How will he provide for you and his 2 children?" "He says I've got to strike out for myself," growled Morland, who had been listening moodily, as with his hands in his pockets he leaned against the terrace rail. "Well, he's going to give nearly $1 million to the library," said Anne despondently, "and that's just about all he possesses. He says it's right to practice philanthropy, and give away one's fortune while one's alive." "Other good and great men have pursued that same plan," said Beth Fordyce, with one of her exalted looks. "Yes," spoke Barbara Van Wyck angrily, "but the other good and great men had many millions to start with. Father's going to give away all he has, except just enough for us to live on in a very small way. It isn't fair to us, and he has no right to do it, but he is simply immovable in the matter." "I feel as Anne does," said Archer seriously. "If it were real true philanthropy it would be a noble deed. But I know Mr. Van Wyck, and he is always rushing suddenly and madly into some new project, which he as quickly abandons and regrets." "Ah, Connie," said Anne, "if there were only a hope of his abandoning this! But when he regrets it, it will be too late." "Yes, the committee men are coming to night for the final acceptance of the deed of gift, or whatever you call it," said Barbara in a tone of blended rage and despair. I had thought Barbara Van Wyck was colorless, but in the intensity of her feelings her eyes flashed and the red rose to her pale cheeks, until she looked like a veritable avenging angel. I hadn't known she possessed so much energy, and I turned to her, saying hopefully, "Can't you persuade your father at least to delay it?" "No. I've tried every argument I know of, and so have Morland and Anne. If Anne can't persuade him, nobody can." Though this praise was grudgingly given, it was unmistakably earnest; and it was clear to be seen that, though Anne and her stepchildren were not congenial, and not even friendly, they had common cause in this impending catastrophe. And I could not blame them. Such ill-advised and misplaced generosity was absurd, and seemed to me to argue Mr. Van Wyck's mind somewhat unbalanced. But as a comparative stranger I didn't like to offer suggestions, or even comment very emphatically. Mrs. Stelton, however, felt no such restraint. "It's outrageous!" she cried. "It's contemptible! I never heard of such a performance. If I were you, Morland, I should have my father adjudged insane." "He is insane on that subject," muttered Morland. "But what can I do about it? If you knew my father as I do, you'd know that, insane or not, he will have his own way." "Yes, he will," said Anne, sighing, and looking so adorably pathetic that it didn't seem possible any one could disappoint her as Van Wyck proposed to do. "Won't he listen to you, Anne?" I asked. "Doesn't he care for your comfort and happiness?" "No," said Anne, and though she looked the picture of utter hopelessness, she showed also a cool reserve that warned me not to intrude too far upon her personal affairs. "Of course he cares for Anne," broke in Archer, "but I tell you he's out of his head. He doesn't know what he's doing." "He isn't out of his head, Connie," returned Anne gently, "and he does know what he's doing. I'm going to try, once more, before the committee comes, to make him change his mind, but I haven't much hope. Come, people, we must go and dress for dinner." Archer threw discretion to the winds and gazed frankly at Anne as he said, "How can he refuse you anything? No man could, I know." Anne, though her color rose a little, didn't even glance at Archer, but turning to me, walked by my side toward the house, chatting lightly on trivial subjects. Later, as we gathered around the dinner table, one could scarcely believe there was such an undercurrent of trouble among the Van Wicks. Our host was unusually bland and affable, Barbara was placid, and Morland was the debonair man of the world that society requires. As to Anne, she was a marvel. In a dinner gown of pale yellow satin, which suited especially well her exquisite coloring, her wonderful hair coiled low, and her great eyes shining, she seemed animated by some unusual energy. She was roguish and dictatorial by turns. She was dignified one moment, and softly pathetic the next. I couldn't make her out.
Either she had persuaded her husband to abandon his plan, or the matter was still undecided. At any rate, she could not have tried and failed, and still have shown this vivacity. But I did not yet know my Anne. I sat next her, and dinner was not half over before she confided to me the news of her total failure.
"Not only did David refuse to listen to me," she said, "but he forbade me to speak to him again on the subject; and he spoke to me in such a way and in such language that I can never forgive him."
"Anne," I exclaimed, for though smiling, her smile was assumed for the other's benefit, and her low tones, heard only by me, were full of bitterness and desperate grief. "Anne," I murmured involuntarily, "let me help you. What can I do?"
"Nothing," she replied. "No one can help me."
Perhaps it was the pathos of the situation, perhaps it was her marvelous beauty enhanced by the dramatic moment, or perhaps it was inevitable, but I fell in love with Anne Van Wyck then and there. Or rather, it was an awakening to the fact that I had always loved her, even when we were school-time friends. Naturally, I had sufficient self-control not to disclose this secret even by a glance, but repeated in carefully modulated tones my desire and willingness to help her if possible; and then, with an effort, I turned to talk to my neighbor on the other side. It proved to be Beth Fordyce, and her pale blue eyes lighted as she began to talk eagerly to me.
"Let us make a pact, Mr. Sturgis," she said. "I, too, want to help Anne, and surely together we can do something."
It was quite evident that she had overheard my words, and this annoyed me; and I answered that, with all the willingness in the world, I failed to see how Mrs. Van Wyck's guests could do anything in this matter. She took the hint, and changed the subject; but almost immediately after Mrs. Stelton's shrill voice was heard, addressing the table at large.
"Well, I think you're perfectly horrid, Mr. Van Wyck," she exclaimed, shaking a beringed hand at him. "To give away all that lovely money that ought to belong to Anne and Barbie and Mr. Morland."
The last name was accompanied by a coquettish glance in Morland's direction, but she went on, addressing her host.
"Why, if a husband of mine did that, I'd shut him up on bread and water for a week."
"Perhaps he would enjoy the rest, Mrs. Stelton," said Van Wyck, gazing at her blandly. The man had a way of saying these things which, though rude, was rather enjoyable to disinterested hearers. Good-natured Mrs. Stelton laughed.
"Oh, what waggery!" she cried. "But if it brought him to his senses, I shouldn't mind. I've a notion to shut you up for a week, Mr. Van Wyck, and let you think this matter over."
"Though I always enjoy your witty chat, my dear Mrs. Stelton, I must beg of you to drop this subject." And this time Mr. Van Wyck's air of finality brought us a respite from Mrs. Stelton's silly observations. But Morland gave one parting shaft. "If you do this thing, Dad," he growled, "you'll be mighty sorry." A silence fell. It was not so much what Morland said, but the quiet intensity of his tone which seemed to convey a definite threat. Indeed, his father must have felt it, for he looked up quickly at his son. But he only said sarcastically, "I thank you for your warning," and then the subject really was dropped. Anne resumed her gaiety, though I now knew for a certainty it was all a pretence. Con Archer nobly helped her out, and chatted lightly and gracefully. Barbara continued to sulk in silence, but all the rest rose to the occasion, and only appropriate dinner-table talk was heard. Coffee was served in the drawing-room for the ladies, while the men remained at table. Perhaps from a sense of duty, Archer made one more effort. "I say, Van Wyck," he began, "I know it's none of my business, but mayn't I suggest, as man to man, that you think this matter over a bit longer before making your decision? You know, to a disinterested observer, the gift you propose to make seems out of all proportion to its object, and I can't help thinking that on second thoughts you would agree to this yourself." "Mr. Archer," said Van Wyck coldly, "the only one of your remarks to which I agree is your first one, that it is none of your business." Condren Archer flushed, but as David Van Wyck's guests were not unused to his scathing speeches, this one was not openly resented, and Archer said nothing further. And then, seemingly unable to control himself, Morland blurted out, "I say, Dad, you just can't do it." "Can't? and the elder Van Wyck raised his eyebrows at his son. "No, can't," Morland went on, blindly angry now. "It's heathenish. It's a crime against your wife and daughter, to say nothing of me. I tell you, you can't." David Van Wyck's clear cutting tones fell like icicles. "If you will be present, Morland, at the meeting this evening, I shall take pleasure in showing you that I can." "You bet I'll be there," and Morland looked almost like a belligerent boy as he met the cold stare of his father's eyes. "I'm glad you accept my invitation. And now shall we join the ladies?" Rising from the table, we crossed the hall to the drawing room, and perhaps 4 angrier men never wore the smiling mask of politeness. Anne, seated in a carved high-backed chair, made an exquisite picture, and she turned her beautiful appealing eyes to her husband as he entered. David Van Wyck crossed the room straight to her. Placing his hands on the 2 carved griffins' heads that formed the arms of the chair, he leaned over the beautiful face upturned to his and whispered a few words in Anne's ear. Then he lightly kissed her on the cheek and, without a word to anyone else, strolled out of the room toward the study. What he said to her nobody knew, but Anne turned deathly white and grasped the carved chair arms as if in extremest agony. I was uncertain whether to notice this and go to her assistance, or whether to keep up the farce of gay conversation in an endeavour to cover her agitation. Morland gave his stepmother one glance, clenched his teeth, and muttering "Brute!" strode off after his father. Without hesitation, Archer drew a chair to Anne's side and sitting down took her hand in his. But he erred, for Anne drew away her hand with a freezing dignity, and rising came over and sat by Mrs. Stelton. And then I was surprised by another of Anne's absolutely inexplicable changes of mood. "What a heavenly brooch!" she said, smiling at Mrs. Stelton. "Florentine work, isn't it? I perfectly adore those things. I have one something like it, but a more conventional design. Don't you just love to buy things in Florence, or in Naples, or indeed any part of Italy? Italy is lovely, isn't it?" Mrs. Stelton stared at this flow of insane talk, and I suddenly wondered if Anne were hysterical. I saw Archer move as if to approach her, and then turn on his heel again, doubtless fearing rebuff. So I dared to venture myself. "Mrs. Van Wyck," I said, "won't you come with me for a little walk on the terrace? I'm sure the cool air will be refreshing." "Thank you," said Anne simply, and she went with me at once, draping the long train of her gown over her arm as we passed through the hall. "You are very good," she said a little wearily as we stepped out onto the terrace. "How did you know I wanted to get away?" I stifled an impulse to tell her that love helped me to read her thoughts, and said quietly, "I know you're troubled about that plan of your husband's, but let us hope for the best." "There is no longer room for hope," she said dully. "Come, let us look in at the window." Of course I followed her along the terrace to the windows of the great study. We could easily look in, and the deep colors of the stained glass prevented our being seen by those inside. And anyway there was surely no harm in it. We saw Mr. Van Wyck and Morland and 3 other men who doubtless represented the committee. "Yes," murmured Anne musingly, "there they are. Mr. Miller, Mr. Brandt, and Mr. Garson. I do not blame them. Of course, if David offers them this money they'd be foolish not to take it. Mr. Brandt is the only one who has really over-urged in the matter. In fact, he suggested it to David first. Oh, Raymond, isn't it too bad?" It was the first time she had called me by my first name, and I felt a thrill that blotted out all thought of Van Wyck or his money. "And you mustn't think," she went on, "that I'm selfish or ungenerous. If David were honestly a philanthropist, or if I weren't so sure that he'd regret this later, as he does all his erratic impulses, I'd feel different about it. But you see how it is, don't you, Raymond?" "Yes, Anne, I see how it is." And though I spoke quietly, my heart was in a tumult. "Oh, look!" she cried. "Morland is getting angry. He is quarreling with his father." "Don't be alarmed," I said. "Morland can never get the better of that man. His father will not mind anything he says." But it was evident that Morland had said something that his father did mind, for the elder man's temper was roused, and the 2 were certainly in deadly earnest. We could hear no word that was spoken, but the 3 visitors looked appalled, and were evidently trying to pacify the combatants. "Come away, Anne," I said, sick at heart over the whole matter. "You can do nothing. Why torture yourself by looking on? Let me tell you what I bought you for a gift." "What?" she asked, but without interest. I led her back across the terrace as I told her of a beautiful piece of Venetian glass that I had brought for her. It was a gem, rare and valuable, but I would not have lauded it as I did except in an endeavor to distract her mind from the sight she had just seen. "Where is it?" she asked, at last, faintly interested. "I gave it to a footman when I came in," I replied. "Then he will have given it to my maid, and it will be in my room," she said. Then, hesitatingly, "Don't think it strange, will you, if I don't tell David that you gave it to me? He is peculiar, you know." "Jealous, you mean?" I said, laughing. "That doesn't surprise me, and, truly, I'm glad of the fact that I can make him jealous." But I'm not sure that Anne heard this, so preoccupied was she with her own thoughts. We returned to the drawing room, but it was not long before we all went to our rooms. Anne bade me good night on the stair landing. "David and Morland are still shut up with that committee," she said, "and I am going at once in search of the gift you brought me. I know I shall love it." "For the sake of the giver," I interrupted, with a gay foolery that sounded as if I didn't mean it. But I did. "Not at all," said Anne saucily. "I shall love it only for its beauty and intrinsic worth. And if it's Venetian glass, it must have both. I hope to goodness it isn't smashed." "I think not. I had it packed carefully. Good night, Anne." "Good night," she said, her long lashes sweeping her cheeks, and then added, as an afterthought, "Raymond." And as she disappeared, I wondered whether she had spoken my name from pure coquetry, or what. Chapters 3 and 4